What if the most profound spiritual awakening in modern history didn't happen on a mountaintop, or after decades of meditation, or through years of disciplined practice, but in the middle of the night, in a dark room, at the absolute bottom of despair? That's exactly what happened to Eckhart Tolle at the age of 29. And out of that single shattering night came one of the most widely read spiritual books of our era, The Power of Now. This is Chapter 0, the introduction, the origin story, and it's called The Truth That Is Within You, because that's precisely what this entire book is pointing at. Not something you need to go out and find, not something that belongs to enlightened masters or ancient traditions, something that is already inside you, waiting to be recognized. So before we get into the teachings themselves, we need to understand where they came from and why that matters. Because once you hear what Tolle went through to arrive at what he's sharing, the words he writes carry a completely different weight. Eckhart Tolle opens this introduction with a simple, almost jarring admission. For almost the entirety of his 20s, he lived in a near-constant state of anxiety, broken up by periods of deep suicidal depression. Not occasional sadness, not everyday stress. We're talking about a pervasive, grinding suffering that colored every part of his existence. And he says something striking about this period, that looking back on it now feels like remembering someone else's life entirely. That distance isn't accidental. It's a sign of just how complete the transformation he eventually underwent actually was. But before that transformation, there was the suffering, and it reached its peak one night, not long after his 29th birthday, when he woke up in the early hours of the morning, gripped by a feeling of absolute dread. He'd experienced this kind of waking dread before, but this night was different. This night it was more intense than anything he had felt before. Everything around him, the dark room, the furniture, the distant sound of a passing train, felt alien and hostile, meaningless, and the most unbearable thing of all, he says, was his own existence. He genuinely could not see the point of continuing. The longing to simply not exist had grown stronger than any desire to keep going. This is where we find him, at the very edge. And it's precisely at that edge that something remarkable is about to happen. The truth that is within you, it turns out, sometimes only becomes accessible when everything else has completely broken down. Right at the moment of his deepest despair, a thought kept circling through Tolle's mind. A thought most of us have probably felt at some point in our lives, the feeling of not being able to live with yourself anymore. But something unusual happened. Instead of just letting that thought wash over him, he actually stopped and noticed it. And what he noticed cracked something open. If he could not live with himself, that sentence implied two separate things, an I and a self, that the I could no longer tolerate, two entities. So which one was real? He described being stunned by this simple but disorienting question, and in that moment of genuine bewilderment, his mind went quiet. Not through effort, not through technique, just quiet, completely still. He was fully conscious, but the mental noise had stopped. What followed was an experience he describes as being drawn into a kind of vortex. There was fear, his body shook, and then, from somewhere deep inside him, he heard or felt the words, "Resist nothing." And so he stopped resisting. He let himself fall into what felt like an interior void, a darkness not outside him, but within him. And then there was nothing, no memory of what came after, just absence. This moment is the pivot point of the entire introduction and in many ways of the entire book. The recognition that the suffering self is not the only self, that behind the thinker there is something else, is the seed of the truth that is within you. Tolle didn't reason his way there. He fell into it. He came back into awareness the next morning, drawn out of sleep by the sound of a bird. And this is where the telling of his story becomes almost impossible to describe in ordinary terms, which is probably why he reaches for an image like a diamond making a sound. That's what the bird song felt like. Not just pleasant, precious, alive in a way that seemed to vibrate with meaning. He opened his eyes, and the dawn light was coming through the curtains, and he says he knew, not thought, knew, that there was infinitely more to light than we ordinarily realize, that the soft glow filtering into the room was, in some way he couldn't explain, love itself. He walked around his room, picking things up, a pencil, an empty bottle, just marveling at the simple fact that they existed at all. Later that day, he walked through the city in a state of pure wonder, as though he had just arrived on this planet and was seeing it for the first time. For the next 5 months, he lived in uninterrupted peace and bliss. Eventually, that intensity softened, or rather, it became his baseline, his natural state. He could still function in the world. But he knew with complete certainty that nothing he could ever do or achieve would add anything to what he already had. He didn't yet have words for what had happened, but he knew something fundamental had shifted. Years later, after encountering spiritual texts and teachers, he came to understand it, and that understanding forms the backbone of the teaching this book carries. It took Tolle several years of reading and learning before he could articulate what he had gone through. But when he could, the explanation was clear. The intense, unbearable pressure of suffering that night had forced his consciousness to completely withdraw from its identification with the fearful, unhappy self he had believed himself to be. And that self, the one built from thought, from fear, from accumulated mental patterns, was ultimately a fiction. A construction of the mind, not real in any deep sense. When consciousness withdrew from it so completely and so suddenly, that false self simply collapsed, like pulling a plug on something inflatable. And what remained was what Tolle calls his true nature, pure consciousness, present and aware before it had attached itself to any particular form or identity. He describes this as the ever-present I am. He later learned to enter that timeless inner space intentionally. He describes dwelling in states of bliss and sacredness that made even his original awakening seem pale by comparison. There was a period where he had nothing on the material level, no relationship, no job, no home, no social role, and he spent nearly 2 years sitting on park benches in a state of extraordinary joy. Eventually, people began approaching him, drawn by something they sensed in his presence, asking how they could have what he had. His answer was always the same: you already have it. Your mind is just too loud for you to feel it. That response, repeated and deepened over years of working with people, became this book. The truth that is within you is not something he invented. It is something he remembered and now points others toward. Tolle is transparent about what this book is trying to do, and it works on 2 distinct levels simultaneously. The first level is about helping you see clearly what is false in you. That includes the nature of human unconsciousness, the compulsive patterns of the mind, and the ways that suffering gets perpetuated, not just in individual lives, but across relationships, communities, and nations. He's careful to point out that this isn't about turning your false self into a problem or a project. That would just be the false self perpetuating itself under a different name. The second level is about something more direct. It's about pointing you toward an awakened state of consciousness that is available right now. Not as a future destination, not as something you earn, but as something already present that you can access in this moment. And he's honest that not all the passages in this book are primarily informational. Some of them are designed to actually draw you into a different state of consciousness as you read them. He describes addressing himself not just to your thinking mind, but to the deeper knower within you, the part that recognizes spiritual truth when it hears it, not because it was taught it, but because it already knows it. That recognition is what the truth that is within you actually means. He also makes an important point. This isn't a comparative theology or a new philosophical system. It draws from many traditions, Jesus, the Buddha, A Course in Miracles, but only to show that across all of them, there has always been one essential teaching. And that teaching doesn't come from outside you. It comes from the source within. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with this chapter. Genuinely, it means a lot. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I'd love to read your response in the comments. Is there a moment in your own life where things had to completely fall apart before something clearer could emerge? How did that feel at the time, and how do you see it now? Take a moment with that. If you want to go deeper into the power of now together, make sure you subscribe, because we're going chapter by chapter through this book, and what comes next builds directly on everything covered here. The truth that is within you isn't going anywhere. See you in the next one.